Hello and welcome once again to Yoga Dharma TV. So today we're going to be exploring and looking at Ardha Mukha Svanasana or downward facing dog. We'll be looking at some adjustments and modifications so that we can hopefully achieve a downward dog that suits us as an individual, as a part of maybe a group or one type of adjustment. So I'm Martin and this is Fran. We'll be working together today. This video is also in support of our 200-hour teacher training courses as well. So Fran is going to demonstrate downward facing dog. We'll start by just having a go at some quite basic adjustments and modifications and explaining why we're doing that as we go along. So Fran, if you come into downward facing dog. So there are videos online on our YouTube channel that talk about basic alignment. So I'm not necessarily going to be talking about the basic alignment, but just some modifications and adjustments and how we correct the alignment. So one of the first adjustments I think is useful to learn is to think about bringing the pelvis into a more neutral position, and we can do that by pressing the heels of the hands into the top back of the pelvis. So I gently press my hands into the pelvis, then slide the hands back so the hips start to move back. You might see that as the hips move back. And then to bring the pelvis into a more neutral position, I'm again pushing the heels of the hands back into the pelvis and then sliding them down towards the shoulder blades. So that should begin to bring the pelvis into a more neutral position. And we're looking to achieve that natural lordotic curve in the lumbar spine. Now you have to remember, if someone's short in their hamstrings, then we may have to bend the knees, because the first place you're going to feel this, once you start to correct the alignment of these postures, the first place you're going to feel it is in the hamstrings. Okay, so the next adjustment we're looking at, once Fran gets herself back into downward facing dog, is... Okay, so I'm going to place my foot between Fran's legs, and I'm going to take my fingers and we're going to curl them around the front of the pelvis. So if you just curl the fingers in the front of the pelvis here, you're going to feel those two iliac crests, or the two edges of the pelvis here. So the adjustment is to just use your fingers, it won't hurt the student, just lean back slightly. And what this does, it tends to lengthen the back, and it will also take the weight away from the hands and the wrists. So if you have a student who tends to collapse forward in their downward facing dog, this is a good adjustment for getting them to realize how much weight is going through their hands. And again, you might need to get them to bend their knees slightly. Okay, so one of the things you're going to see going wrong quite a bit in your students in Ardha Mukha Svanasana or downward facing dog, they tend to hyperextend in the thoracic spine. So the thoracic spine is that part of the spine between the shoulder blades, and it's where the spine attaches to the rib cage. And you'll see this when students hyperextend in this space. What happens is they push into that space. It gives them the feeling they're coming really deeply into downward facing dog, and the arms then do this inward rotation, or outward rotation I should say, closing down the space between the neck and the shoulders. Although it might stretch this part of your back a lot, what it won't do, it won't get the pelvis back into that neutral position, and it will give students the feeling they come into a really deep downward dog, but they won't actually be stretching the hamstrings at all. So Fran is going to come into downward facing dog and attempt to come into a hyperextended type of downward dog. So this is evidenced by students push into this space here. They really collapse the space here between the shoulder blades. The shoulder blades tend to roll right in on themselves, and the upper arms then close right down. So one way of counteracting that is to grip the arms with your thumbs and fingers and turn the arms outwardly like this. The other way is to place one hand at the back of the pelvis, one hand between the shoulder blades. So I'm going to ask Fran to gently push into my right hand, and then my left hand then starts to lengthen out the back, again stretching out the hamstrings. So this is a couple of ways of counteracting someone who's hyperextending in the thoracic spine. Okay, another adjustment we can look at is if if Fran comes into downward facing dog again. So this is where the adjuster uses their body weight more than anything else to correct the alignment of the student. So you have to get in quite close. You do have to be really careful if you're a male to female student. You can only use the top of your pelvis and the belly and above. Be careful not to lean into it too closely. So the two hands are going to again come to that position at the back of the pelvis that we've used a couple of times. So the heels of my hands are at the top rim of the pelvis. And then I'm going to lean in, place my chest in the back of the pelvis, and I can take my hands along the thighs, and I just gently take the weight in to the pelvis, so it's in and then up and away. Now, it really should feel quite nice to your student. There shouldn't be any stress on the hamstring. It should feel quite nice and natural, and it should, again, take the weight away from the hands and away from the wrists, because a lot of students do tend to collapse the weight forward into the hands. So if you'd like to come back down into a resting position again. One more adjustment. This is one for students with weak wrists. So what we've done is we've rolled the mat up, and then we get the student to place the fingers over the edge of the rolled up mat, and then it encourages the weight to come into the roots of the fingers. Is that right, Fran? The roots of the fingers, and it encourages the weight to come away from the heels of the hands. So if your student has weak wrists, so you want to demonstrate that? Okay, so you can see that the weight's encouraged to come into the forward part of the hands, the roots of the fingers. The fingers are nice and evenly spread, and it tends to bring the weight away from the wrists. I think another common thing you're going to find in a yoga studio with your yoga students is the adductor muscles are not used sufficiently, or quite often not at all. So the adductor muscles are the muscles on the inner thighs here. And you're going to evidence that by, if you walk around the back of your class and look at the reverse part of your students, so your students from the back end of your studio, what you'll notice if you look at the feet, the arches will collapse, and the inner ankles will collapse downwards and inwards. And there's a couple of ways that you can remedy this. The first way is to just verbally adjust your student, and you advise them to just gently rotate their knees in an outward fashion, so it's a gentle outward rotation. Do you want to demonstrate that, Fran? Is that possible? And Fran doesn't naturally collapse here, so it's not so easy. Nevertheless, so what you'll find is the ankles collapse, they'll drop in here, and you're going to get your student verbally say to your student, just gently rotate your knees slightly outwardly for me, slightly away from one another. What it does is it activates those inner thighs and inner calves, and it lifts up the ankles. And the other way is to, again, you've got to be careful where you place your hands. You have to keep them quite low. So my hands are palmed away from one another. They slide between the inner thighs, just above the knees, and then they grip the top of the thighs, and you just gently lean back. And it does exactly the same thing. It encourages those inner thighs to become active. And it really is a nice stretch for your students. They really will appreciate this one. Well, that's all from us today, myself and Fran. We hope we've given you some tips and pointers for successfully completing, teaching or adjusting or refining downward facing dog. So if you've liked this video, it would be great if you could press that subscribe button. If you've got any thoughts or comments, any questions, leave it in the box, the appropriate box, and we'll get back to you ASAP. And any likes you'd like to dish out would be great as well. Thank you. Bye.